Hi, my name is Paul Smith, and welcome to the webcast. So we'll be talking about storytelling in this seminar, specifically the 10 stories that great leaders tell. My name is Paul Smith again. I've spent most of my career in more typical corporate jobs. So 2 years as a consultant at the company that is now known as Accenture, and 20 years at the Procter & Gamble company. And along that way, I just became fascinated with this concept of storytelling, and I started interviewing the people that I admired the most in that realm, the leaders that I wanted to work for and grow up and be like when I was a little bit more senior in the organization. And then eventually I started interviewing leaders outside the company. And at this point, I'm up to about 300 senior executives, CEOs, leaders at companies all over the world, 25 countries around the world, dozens of industries and hundreds of companies. And each of the leaders that I've interviewed has given me probably 8 to 12 different stories. So if you do the math, I've literally documented around 3,000 individual business stories. And so what that's allowed me to do, of course, is to reverse engineer my way into what works and what doesn't. And that's what led me to write my first book on the topic, which is Lead with a Story, which led to a string of others, culminating in the one that we're going to talk about today, which is the 10 stories that great leaders tell. In fact, so let's get right into that. And in fact, I want to start with why I even wrote that particular book and the one that we're going to talk about today. Because after having written 3 previous books, all on the topic of storytelling, the answer is that I think I covered 70 different types of stories that people need to tell either at home or at work. And I think I used about 250 different examples, the best examples that I came across out of the 3,000 or so stories that I documented. And that's just a lot of stories, and I recognize that. So at some point I was looking for an opportunity to focus a little bit and help people who are new to this area of storytelling to find the place to start. What are the most important stories that I should start if I'm new at this? So that's one reason. The more practical reason is that I got approached by a publisher who only publishes books designed to be read in 1 hour. So here they were coming to me with a challenge. We'd like you to write a book on storytelling, but not like the other books you've written. We want a really short, focused book that you could read in 1 hour. And so that's really the final, motivation that I needed. That was really the opportunity to write a very short, very focused book just on the 10 stories that I think you need to tell if you're new to storytelling. And even if you're not new to storytelling, if you're not telling these 10 stories, you probably should be. So that's what got me to this point. So let's dive right in. All right. So I want to start then with, how did I pick the most important 10 stories for any leader to tell? That's a rather ambitious goal to state that I'm going to pick the most important 10 stories. So recognize again that I've been working in the storytelling world for about 7 or 8 years now. Actually, gosh, it's almost 10. It's almost a decade now that I've been researching and writing stories for books. And so I chose 4 criteria to help me choose the most important 10 stories. The first criteria was I wanted to pick stories that I knew my executive clients wanted help with. So I literally just looked back at my almost decade of working with senior executive clients in this arena, at the stories that they were asking me for help with. All right, so literally just look back through all of my files and documentation and emails from clients to see which of the stories they're asking for help with, not the ones that I'm trying to teach them, but the ones that they're coming to me asking for, because I wanted this to be a practical list that I knew that people wanted help in these areas. So that was the first criteria, and maybe the most important. The second one was that I wanted to pick areas that I knew that leaders needed to exert some influence in an organization. And so this, quite frankly, was my own personal observation from literally 30 years of working in the business world. There are areas where leaders need to exert some influence, and there are other areas that are just not as important for the leader to be actively involved on a daily basis. So I think you'll see that play out in the list. All right, third, I wanted to pick stories where that would be helpful for leaders across all job functions. So not just the CEO or the chief operating officer or the vice president, but the head of HR, the head of finance and accounting, the head of marketing and sales, and the chief engineering officer, the head of IT. A design leader. I wanted stories that every leader at the company would need to tell, not just some functional silo. So that was the third criteria. The fourth criteria was I wanted to pick stories that I knew wouldn't need to change very often. So these are stories that you can be confident and invest time to develop, because you're going to tell them over and over again for years, if not decades. Right? There's some stories that you'll tell once or twice, and then you'll never need to tell it again because the need is gone. But other stories, you'll need to tell for a long time. For example, the company founding story. Well, that should never change, right? You can tell that for the entire, for always, right? Your vision story. Your vision can change from time to time, but not every 6 months. Maybe every 3 or 4 or 5 years. So your vision story shouldn't change that often. So I think you'll see that play out in here too. These are stories that won't need to change very often. So those are the 4 criteria I used. And those criteria led me, out of the literally thousands of stories that I've trafficked in and the dozens of types of stories that I advocate, into the following 10. All right, so let's get into the list. So I want to start with the first 4, because they go together, because they're all about setting direction for the organization. All right, so the first one is where we came from. So that's a founding story. Why we can't stay there. So that's a case for change story. Where we're going, which is a vision story, and how we're going to get there, which is a strategy story, because a strategy is about how you're going to get from where you are now to where you want to be. So if you can imagine yourself being able to tell those 4 stories, you just think about that. That means you can clearly articulate to the organization where you came from, why you can't stay there, where you're going, and how you're going to get there. I mean, I think any leader who can articulate those 4 stories well has a much better chance of getting the organization to go wherever it is they want them to go. And these are all real stories, by the way. This isn't just a strategy statement or a vision statement. The vision story is a real story. It's a narrative about the future that's so compelling that people want to follow you there, right? The founding story isn't just where and when you started the company. It's the story about why you started the company. What nobody ever quit their job, risked everything, and started a business for a boring reason, right? There's always an interesting reason behind it. So these are the real stories behind those four topics in the business world. All right, so let's move to the next 4, because they go together as well, but they're more about who we are as an organization. So number 5 is what we believe. So that's a corporate values story. Who we serve, number 6, that's a customer story, a story about the customer, so that everybody that you work with can understand that customer on a personal, visceral level, so that they know who it is that they're working for. Number 7, what we do for our customers. So that's a classical sales story. What it is that you do that's so awesome that other people should pay you money to do it. And then number 8 is why we're different from our competitors. So I call that a marketing story, because marketing is usually about how we're different from our competitors, to differentiate yourself from your competitors. So imagine that you're a leader who can tell those 4 stories. You can easily explain to people who you are, who you serve, what you do for those customers, and how you're different from your competitors. I think every leader needs to be able to tell that. And here's where I'll remind you that I think these stories are important across all functions of leaders. So certainly the marketing story, the head of marketing should be able to tell. But people in marketing should be able to tell lots and lots of marketing stories, right? But people in other functions should at least be able to tell one, right? Even if you work in IT or human resources or engineering, you ought to be able to tell one good marketing story. You need to be able to articulate to people inside and outside the company how you're different from your competitors. Even if you don't work in sales, salespeople have lots and lots and lots of stories they tell. But even if you work in accounting, you should be able to tell one good sales story, right? For inside your department, so your department understands what it is that you're selling, but when you meet people outside the company as well. Any leader needs to be able to articulate at least one good marketing story, one sales story, one customer story, a vision story, a founding story, etc. All right, so that takes us through the first 8. We got 2 more though, but they're more personal to who we are, who you are as the leader, okay? So number 9 is why I lead the way I do. So that's a personal leadership philosophy story. And number 10 is why you should want to work here. So you the person you're talking to, not you, right? So And that's, I call that a recruiting story, obviously. And that's important because it's not just the job of the recruiting department or the HR department to bring people into the company. Every leader's job, part of it, is to bring in talented people into the organization, to attract talented people, bring them in and have them want to stay and follow your leadership. All right. So if you can articulate those last two stories well, you have a much better chance of bringing in talented people, having them stay, and having them follow your leadership. Okay. So those are the 10 types of stories. So what I want to do is give you an example of a few of them. I don't have time to go through all 10, but I want to give you an example of 2 or maybe 3 of them. All right. So let me start with number 5. What we believe, a corporate values story. All right. So most people on this webinar should be familiar with the company Walmart. Okay. It's probably the largest retailer in the world, if not in the Western Hemisphere. And Walmart is founded by a man named Sam Walton. Well, in the United States, in the state of Texas, there was a retailer, a grocery retailer named H-E-B. And H-E-B was the largest grocery retailer in that state of Texas until Walmart came along. So around the mid-1980s, Walmart became a little bit larger than H-E-B. In fact, it's much larger now. But about that time, the CEO of H-E-B Grocers, whose name was Charles Butt, the founder of the grandson of the founder of the company, called Sam Walton on the phone, the founder of Walmart, called him on the phone in Bentonville, Arkansas, where he lives and the company's headquartered, and apparently said these 2 things to him. First of all, congratulations, you're now the largest retailer in my state, and my company has been for 50 years. But secondly, I'd love to know how you did it. I'd like to bring my leadership team to your headquarters on a learning mission and have you teach us what it is that you're doing so well that you're now the largest retailer in the world. Now, Sam Walton could have been forgiven, of course, for simply saying, no, you're our competitor. I'm not going to teach you, how we did it. But that's not what he said. What he said was, well, I'm not sure what I can teach you, but I'd be happy to try. So they made an appointment for that leadership team to come to Arkansas and meet him at one of his local Walmart stores. So on the appointed day, at the appointed hour, all these executives, came into this store. They'd flown, hundreds of miles to meet him. And they walked through the store looking for him, and they saw Sam Walton at the end of an aisle talking to a customer. And they started marching up the aisle to have their meeting with him. And he saw them coming and he stopped them. He said, Charles, hold on. I'm talking to this young woman. I'll be with you in a minute. And he turned back around and he finished his conversation with this young woman. And he was trying to sell her an ironing board cover. And he was talking about the different sizes and colors and different prices. And eventually she chose one of them and put it in her buggy and shoved off to the register. Well, Sam Walton turned around then to all these executives and to Charles Butt, the CEO, and said, Charles, do you know how many worn out ironing board covers there are in this country? We're going to sell 1 million of them this month. Now, that's kind of the end of the story, because just hearing that, the truth is they probably, if they were paying attention, already learned an awful lot about what made Walmart special that wasn't true at other places. So just hearing that story, you can learn some of these lessons about what's important to Sam Walton, the leader, and the values of the company. Well, first of all, the second on my list here is the customer is number one, right? I mean, the customer is the most important thing. Here he had all these executives whom he'd invited to fly hundreds of miles to meet with him at that time in that place, but he made them wait while he took care of a customer, right? The customer's number one. Another one on there, the other retailers are our competitors, but they're not our enemies. We serve the same customers. If we can help those customers better without giving away our secrets, we should. Number 3 there, the importance of understanding what the customer wants and needs. How do you think Sam Walton knew there were so many worn out ironing board covers? And the answer is because he asked. He cared enough to find out from the customers themselves. You can also learn about, persistence, how he didn't give up, until she was happy with her choice and bought the item, or you could learn about his passion for winning. Clearly, he was excited about how many worn out ironing board covers there are. He's the CEO of a $1 billion company. yet he had passion for selling that one ironing board cover. So, and there are probably dozens of other lessons you could learn from this, but the point is, this one story articulates many values of the company Walmart, and it articulates them in a far better way than just being given the list, right? If you were a new hire at Walmart, on your first day, they could give you the list. Here's the list of our company values, know them. And then probably go in a file drawer and you'd never see it again. But that story, now you know what it means to have a passion for winning. You know what it means to treat the customer like they're number one, right? The story articulates it and illustrates it far better than a piece of paper. All right, so that was number 5. Let's skip to number 8, how we're different from our competitors' story. So the example here, my favorite example here is from a guy named Sherrod Madison. So Sherrod is the CEO of United Building Maintenance. So it's a commercial cleaning company. So they come into your offices at night and clean the office. So when he's calling on a new prospective client, he probably brings his sales manager with him, and they probably have a sales pitch that they go through. But he almost always tells them a story about what he does when he gets a new client. He says, every time I get a new client, there's a 30-day transition period between when I sign the contract and when I start, cleaning the offices. And he says, during that 30 days, I always do the same thing. I sneak into the offices in the middle of the night and watch how they're cleaning it. Now, it's probably less nefarious than I just made it sound, because he gets permission to go do this. But imagine this guy, sneaking in at 2 o'clock in the morning into this building to see how they're cleaning it. And he tells his prospective clients that he does this ahead of time, and he always tells them about the last time he did it. He said, so, a few months ago, we took over the Verizon office building in New Jersey. And so during that 30 days, of course, I go into the building in the middle of the night and because I wanted to see how they're cleaning it. And by the way, I think those employees who are cleaning those offices are contract employees. So he's going to inherit them at the end of the month. So he wants to know if they're well trained, if they have the right equipment, if they're doing a good job. So that's why he does it. Anyway, he goes in there and he said, so the first floor, I found a guy vacuuming the carpets. And he's using the same kind of residential quality vacuum cleaner that I use at home. He said, and the problem is that those corridors are 12 feet wide and it's a half a mile around, right? It's going to take that guy a month just to vacuum those carpets one time. He said, and by the way, that machine's not going to do a very good job, and it's going to break down every couple of weeks because it's not made for that kind of volume. Anyway, he said, when we took over, we put him into a triple wide commercial grade vacuum cleaner that'll do the job much better in a fraction of the time. Plus, that thing's going to last forever. Like it'll never break down. He said, I went to another floor and found a guy shampooing the carpets. And he said it was kind of the same problem, right? He's using the same kind of walk behind, squeeze bottle, vacuum, shampooer that I use at home. And the same problem. It's not going to do a good job. It's going to break down. So when we took over, we put him into one of those, industrial grade riding shampooing machines, right? So it'll do a much better job in a fraction of the time. Plus, it gets the guy off his feet, right? So now he's sitting on this thing, riding around, all right? So not only does it do a better job and faster, but it keeps him from getting injuries, so that we have fewer, injuries on the job and fewer, medical bills. So he said, but I wanted to check one more thing. I wanted to see how they were dusting the cabinets, he said. So I went to find the offices, and I looked on top of all the file cabinets. And sure enough, I saw the same thing on top of all of them. There was a half of a moon swiped out on top. And I said, I know exactly what that means, and you probably do too. He said, those cabinets are standard 5.5 feet tall. So there were, the people cleaning them were probably less than that tall, right? So it's not that they were lazy. They just weren't tall enough to reach all the way to the back of the file cabinets and clean it properly. And that's what leaves the half of a moon swiped out on top. And he said, the truth is, they'd be better off not cleaning it at all, because it's the contrast between the dusty part and the clean part that makes it obvious that it hasn't been cleaned properly. He said, so when we took over, we just gave them these little 18-inch plastic extension wands so they could easily reach the back of the cabinet. Problem solved. So you can, from just hearing that story, you can imagine instead in this meeting, he could have said to his prospective client, well, the reason why we're different than our competitors is we use triple wide industrial grade shampooing machines We use commercial grade vacuum cleaners, and we use 18-inch extension wands for our dust cloths. And that's why we're different than our competitors. And that would be true, right? I mean, those are the three reasons that he uses to differentiate himself from his competitors. But hopefully you can also see that the story is far more compelling and memorable, so that the person hearing the story, they can see in their mind's eye, that guy, riding around on that shampooing machine, like at the ice skating rink. They can imagine and they can see somebody reaching the back of the cabinets with their dust cloth or with their extension wand very easily, right? It forms a visual image that's memorable and compelling, as opposed to just the list of features and benefits. Here are the 3 features and benefits that we have. That's marketing, right? That's a sales pitch. The story it's a marketing story, which is far more powerful. All right, I think I might have time for one more example, and I want to choose number 9 here, which is why I lead the way I do. So that's a personal leadership philosophy story. So the guy this story is about, his name is Mike Figliolo, and his first leadership experience was in the Army. He was in the military. Now, I don't think he ever saw real combat, but he did a number of training exercises. And so his first real opportunity to lead was to lead a platoon of military people in a tank. So that's a picture of him there. He's the one in the middle sitting straddling the gun turret there. So his first exercise was a training exercise where there were 400 tanks on one side of a field and 400 tanks on another side of the field. And it was a 10-mile long, 5-mile wide. Sorry, somebody there's probably converting this to kilometers in their head. My apologies. Simulate or practice battlefield. So imagine this is an exercise with 800 real tanks, but they weren't shooting actual bullets and ordnances at each other. They were just using lasers to target with and identify who got shot. So it was, think of it as a giant game of laser tag, but with real tanks, but lasers. Anyway, so the night before the field exercise, it turns out Mike was commanding the first tank that was going to go into battle on his side of the field with 399 tanks behind him. So he had to sit down with a commanding officer the night before and go through come up with a battle plan, look at a map of the terrain, figure out where the high ground was so that they could have the best strategic chance of winning the battle. So then the next morning, the simulation, starts and he's in his tank and they're driving out onto the field. And he gets to the first place that he has to make a decision which way to turn. And he doesn't know what to do, because apparently a real battlefield looks a little different through the crack in the hatch traveling 40 miles an hour than it does sitting in a conference room under lights looking at a map. So he has a choice to make. Option number 1 is he can stop the tank, turn the light on, get the map out, study it, and figure out what the right thing to do is, which might take 30 seconds. Or he can just guess. Well, Mike chose option 2. So he yelled out, "Driver, turn left," even though he had no idea if that was the right thing to do or not. So the driver turns left. Well, a few seconds later, the light on their in the cabin there went off, which says, "You just got shot by a laser, you're dead." So they had to stop the tank, pop the hatch, get out. Those guys are done for the day. Well, of course, tank number 2 behind him turned left, followed him. And a few seconds later, their light went off. They're dead. Tank number 3 followed them, turned left, light went off. They're dead. But tank number 4 saw 3 tanks turn left and get shot and killed. So they realized that was a mistake. So tank number 4 turned right. And then 396 other tanks behind that turned right. They took the high ground and won the battle. All right. So Mike learned a lesson from that. So he made a mistake, right? He turned left. He should have turned right. But what he learned from that was that sometimes it's better to make the wrong decision fast than the right decision slow, right? And the reason is because, if he had stopped, then there would have been 400 tanks in a row stopped. Easy target for competition to pick off. And it's similar in life and in business sometimes, right? If you stop for too long, your competition is still moving forward. Sometimes it's better to continue to move forward, even if you're not sure it's the right move, because you'll find out pretty soon if that was a mistake, because something bad will happen and you'll realize, oh, that was a mistake. Well, now I'll adjust. And sometimes it's less painful and less costly to just make the mistake than it is to constantly to spend months and months studying the problem and deciding. So today he's a more decisive leader, and he expects other people to be more decisive in their leadership. But he's also very forgiving of mistakes when people make them, as long as they learn from those mistakes. So he tells this story to people when he first meets them to help them understand what kind of a leader he's going to be and what type of leadership he expects from them. And it works far better than just saying, you know, I'm a decisive leader. You should be decisive too. All right. Let me move on. Last couple of things here. I want you to know how to find these stories, because once you, so here's your wish list of stories you need to have, but you need to go find them. So start with this wish list. You got 10, but add to it. Search your own past. Look in your own past. Surely things like this have happened to you before, but also ask other people for them. Okay. Share your wish list with other people. Say, here are the stories I'm looking for. Do you have any that are like this that I can use? Some of my more creative clients use story circles, where once a month they'll all get together for lunch and order a pizza. And the only thing that people in the room are allowed to do is eat pizza and tell stories. And that way they all gain new stories from other people. Some of my clients have, at each of their weekly staff meetings, one person is designated to tell a story, just one story once a week, one person. But this week it's my week, and next week it's your week, and next week it's Bob and Sally, and everybody knows what week is their week, and they have to think of and find a good story to share when it's their week. All right. So at the end of a year, you got 52 great stories. Or you can hold a contest at your company, so a contest for the best stories, and have people submit them, and you'll find yourself very quickly collecting stories. All right, let's see. So I think at this point we're probably just about out of time. So let me just make this offer to you: is if you have questions, I'm happy to field them. My email address is on there. My website is on there. The stories you just heard and the other 7 that I didn't have time to share are in the book, The 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell. My first book, however, is I think the only one of my books that's been translated into Russian. So if you're more interested in reading about stories in Russian, my first book, Lead with a Story, is in Russian at a local Russian publisher. And I think that link there will probably help you find it. But other than that, I'm happy to field your questions offline when you send them in. So thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of the seminars.